Well, it's getting quiet, so let's go ahead and move on. I just want to say to you, first of all, thank you for the prayers last week, and some of you have been asking. So, many of you know I went back for a funeral service, for a memorial service, actually, for a man that was, I consider probably the one that's had the most influence in my life other than my dad. And so it was a bittersweet time because I got to spend time with the family, and the family is his whole family kind of took me in when I was in university, and I would live far away from my family, so holidays and things, when there wasn't enough time to travel home, I would go spend the holidays with their family and do things, so I became very close to the family. So it was a good time because I could reconnect with them, and it was just like family. We felt, the connections there. It was, the ideas, the thoughts. So that was good, and we got to celebrate his life and the impact he had on his life. And I saw people that I hadn't seen in 25 years or so, and some of them were just teenagers last time I saw them. Now they're not teenagers anymore. Let's just put it that way, okay? And one girl came up to me, and she said, "Hi, Doug," and a long time. She didn't say how Joe Bucci, but she said, "I haven't seen you in a long time," and I'm like, "Yeah," and I'm looking at it, and I'm like, "Oh, your face, I know this face," and but she had long gray hair, and I said, "I'm sorry." I said, I know who you are, but I can't remember your name right now." She's like, "It's Joni." And I'm like, "Joni, last time I saw you, you were a teenager with long brown hair and not adult kids and things like that." And she actually had a child in university now. So those things were good. But one of the things that happened in that memorial service and in that day is got to meet these old people that I used to be good friends with and I used to know very well. And there was just even though it was a sad time and we were mourning, it was also a good time because we were making many connections with each other. And there was a kindred type of spirit, a spirit of connecting together, of worshiping together, of celebrating Paul Cloffer's life together, that kind of drew us all together. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a kindred spirit and what that means and how we can see that in the story and the life of Jonathan. And we're going to do it in kind of a weird type of way because we're not going to talk about Jonathan very much. We're going to talk about David a lot. Because David and Jonathan had a kindred spirit. And we're going to look at that and see how we can see that today. Okay? So some of you know already is that we're in part 4, and we're going to call this a kindred spirit in the life of Jonathan, my favorite Bible stories. And I love this story of the life of Jonathan. And if you need to, there's the sermon notes are available on the YouVersion app, or you can, I think I sent out a line message earlier. You can download the PDF and all that kind of good stuff. All right. So this guy and this woman, this is Henny and Madeline, actually, not Madeline, Madeline. And they were part of the original beginnings of GEM, of Glory English Ministry. And I'm looking around, and there's Nancy was here, Fan was here, and may have been here at that time. But Henny and Madeline are from South Africa, and they were here teaching English 20-some years ago. When I first came, I think they came in about 2002, 2003. And in 2005, I was taking a trip to Cambodia. Now, I was going to Cambodia because in March of that year, because in June of that year, I was taking about 40 teenagers and adults, all together, a group of about 40, to Cambodia to do a mission trip, to do a mission project. We were actually going to be there. Actually, I took more than that because we did 2 different groups. We were going to be there 2 weeks with the first group. There was a week break, and then a second group of about 15 was coming in for the next 2 weeks. And so we were doing this pre-trip to go finalize what we were going to do on that mission trip. And now, being a single man at the time, it was before I met Nancy. She thinks I met her sometimes because we figured out there was MRT stations and bus stations that we crossed all the time, so she said I had to meet her sometime. But anyway, before I was aware of Nancy, let's put it that way. So going to Cambodia at that time, I should not go by myself. So I asked people from my church, would anybody like to go with me? Well, Henny and Madeline volunteered to go. I knew them just barely. They just kind of started going to church a little bit before, done a couple of things with them. Well, we go to Cambodia. We spend 7 days in Cambodia, traveling through Cambodia, and about halfway through the trip, we're riding down the road in a van. Henny and I are actually sitting on one bench seat. Madeline's sitting right in front of us, and we're just sitting there talking about different things. And it was one of those situations where, you meet someone and you start talking to them. You're like, I like this person. This is a good person. Well, Madeline, his wife, turns around. And she looks at us and shakes her head. And Henny's like, what? She goes, you two somehow, some way must be brothers. It's like, what? And she goes, you guys think alike? You respond the same way? You have the same ideas? And she just went on and named other things. Because we were a kindred spirit. And Henny is a man that I consider to be one of my best friends throughout life. There's about 4 different men in my life that I said, these are my best, these are friends that I'm best friends with. And don't do it as often, but still keep in contact with him. He still asks me about how things are going here, about my family, and we talk about those type of things and things like that. But we were a kindred spirit. We liked doing things together. We liked barbecuing, but, he's from South Africa, and I'm from the U.S. They braai, we barbecue, but it's the same thing, okay? So there's some things we were different, but we have that kindred spirit. That ideas are the same. How we go about doing things the same. The things that we like and don't like are all there. And so a kindred spirit is simply that type of thing. A person who has the same opinions, feelings, and interests as you. Or this other definition, having the same nature, disposition, or taste. Okay? We both like meat. Oh, that's a like thing, okay? Now, Henny calls fish vegetables. I'm not quite there, but it was pretty close. We both liked serving in the church. We both liked coffee. We both liked studying. We both liked learning. We both liked all these things. It was a kindred spirit. And you've ran into people in your life that have been that way to you too. It's a kindred spirit. You think alike, you act alike, you have the same ambitions, you have the same ideas. Maybe not exactly alike, but pretty close. Well, the story of Jonathan and David is a story of kindred spirits. And we're going to look a little bit more at their friendship, specifically next week. But I want to look at it today in asking why were Jonathan and David such close friends. Now, so far, what we've learned about Jonathan, and this is important, we go back and look at this, because we're going to see some of these same things in David over these next few weeks. We learned about Jonathan that he's a warrior, no doubt about it, okay? He leads men into battle, even from a young age. He's willing to go fight. He's willing to do all those things. He's a natural leader. People tend to follow him. People tend to support him. People tend to group up behind him. So not only was he a leader because he was assigned to be one, he was a natural leader. He's brave. He's loyal. Okay? All those things. We saw how he depended on God, how he trusted in God. They didn't trust in himself. He had confidence in himself, but he trusted in God. And then the last 2 things there aren't checked marked yet. I got a thumbs up on the last one because we haven't really looked at his friendship to David yet. We're going to look at that a little bit today, but mainly next week. And then that second thing, considered God and others first. I gave it a thumbs up, not a check mark, because we've seen that a little bit, but we're going to see that a lot more in the coming weeks about how Jonathan had that type of attitude. And in the first message that we did, we said there were some key things there. One of the key things was that Jonathan's faith in God and his integrity and for leadership called for action. Jonathan wasn't one that just wanted to sit around and talk about what God wanted to do or what they thought God wanted to do or how God was going to lead. Jonathan would say, hey, let's talk about it, then let's go do it. Okay? And he was somebody that got things done. And the other thing about his faith in God is it gave him confidence that anything was possible. How could you be standing at the bottom of a valley looking up at a steep cliff that was full of briars, that was full of loose rocks and everything else, with 20 men up there, and you have one sword between you and your armor bearer thinking, whoa, we're going to gain a victory here. You can only do that if your faith in God gives you confidence. And he did that. And we said that first week that we need more leaders like this, more leaders that model, exemplify faith and trust in God. Because sometimes we don't see that around us. One of the stories that we talked about, and one of the things that we discussed this week was with my mentor that passed away was every time he signed something, he signed it Reverend Paul Cloffer. Okay? Now, Reverend is a term, I can sign my name Reverend Doug. I can, I can say, hey, when people ask, well, what's your name? I say, well, it's Reverend Doug. Because Reverend just simply is a term, it's kind of like doctor. It means you've been ordained into ministry. And he always did that. It didn't matter if he was buying farm equipment, if he was buying cows, if he was buying a Bible, if he was buying McDonald's, it didn't matter what it was. That's always how he signed his name. And we were talking about how he did that not because he wanted a title, but because it was just a little way to share with others about his faith. Maybe someone would ask him, what's this mean? R-E-V, that type of thing. And we thought about, we talked about how us that were ordained, as we were talking about, most of us don't do that. We were talking about how when I was staying with the family and I was walking around the neighborhood in the mornings and going for my morning walks, that I met a couple of different people. I met one guy named El, and El was an elderly man that was out for a walk every morning. He had his cane with him, and he stopped and asked me about him, and I told him what was going on, and he was so sorry to hear that, and he shared stories about how he stopped and talked to him every time, about how he would share the gospel with him and do different things. See, we need leaders that model that and exemplify that type of leadership. That type of willingness to trust in God and to be bold about our trust in God. Next thing we said, Jonathan, the leader, says one of the things that we learned about him was as a leader, he just didn't kind of haphazardly do things. He had a plan and he communicated that plan clearly. And then as we said before, he's a take action guy. And he didn't lead from the back, he led from the front. Okay? And remember, the armor bearer should have gone in front of him, but he went in front of the armor bearer, okay? And also, he wanted the armor bearer to work with him. He didn't say to the armor bearer, I'm going to go fight, you stay right behind me. He said, let's both go. God has given him into our hands, not into my hands. So he was very much with teamwork. And then we said this, he said, when you're in sync with God, in other words, when you're doing the will of God in your life, then good things happen. And good things that happened that day was they had a big victory. And good things will happen when we're in sync with God. And then we talked about the divine moment, and that was Jonathan's divine moment was that morning when he was standing there looking up that cliff. And he had a choice. Could he seize that divine moment, or would he walk away from it? And he chose to seize it. And we need to seize the divine moments in our lives. And then 2 weeks ago, we talked about loyalty. And we said, hey, when we talk about loyalty and we talk about our oaths, consider our oaths and the promises you make to both God and others. So very important. Then keep your focus on God, not your own agenda, needs, or wants. And then we said, be loyal to God and to each other. See, when you're loyal to God, you don't have to make oaths. It's just there. When you're loyal to each other, you don't have to make promises. You don't have to make all these other things. Because you're loyal to that person, you will do what's best for that person in their lives. So loyalty was so very important. So that took us through basically the end of chapter 14. Now in chapter 15, We're not going to read that part of the story, but here's basically what happens. God rejects Saul as king, okay? And it was a sad, tragic thing. And then when we get to chapter 16, that's where Samuel anoints David to be the next king. And then we get to chapter 7, or the end of chapter 16. What we find is that Saul was in torment a lot. And he probably having some fits of rage, some fits of, he may even, one person I was talking to about the last 2 weeks was like maybe he was even bipolar at the time. We don't know. But what we do know is that somebody said, let's find somebody to help calm his nerves. And they brought David in to play a lyre, kind of a tiny harp. And that calmed his nerves and that made him feel good. So he was put into Saul's service, and it says, and we're going to read the scripture later, it says Saul loved him so much, or Saul liked him so much that he loved him, and he made him an armor bearer in his service. Then we get to chapter 17. That's the story of David and Goliath, and that's the one we're going to look at a little bit. And then we get to chapter 18, and we talk about David's and Jonathan's friendship. And this is where we're going to start this morning, is in chapter 18, verse 1. But let's pray before we go any further. Father, I thank you for the story of Jonathan's, the story of his life. Father, as we look at all these stories, and now we have David entering into his life and into his story, help us to understand who they are. Help us to understand their friendship. Help us to understand the importance of those kindred spirits in our life and those good friends, and why it's such a great thing to have. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right. Chapter 18, verse 1, it says, after David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. And there was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. Now, I only want to say this once today. This is a passage of Scripture that has been twisted a lot in the last few years. Okay? This is not about a homosexual relationship. This is about kindred spirits. This is about good friends, best friends. So, there was an immediate bond between them. The NIV says this, says they were one in spirit. The ESV, or the Net says, Jonathan and David became bound together in a close friendship. Another English translation, the ESV, says the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And then the Message translation says this, Jonathan was deeply impressed with David, so an immediate bond was forged between them. It's kind of interesting, right? He was highly impressed with David. So, I got a question. The question is, why? Why all of a sudden is Jonathan highly impressed with David? Why all of a sudden did their souls knit together? Why all of a sudden did they become one in spirit? Because this is probably not the first time Jonathan has met David. Okay? So something changed. Look at this. This is back in chapter 16. Okay? Chapter 16, it says this. David went to Saul to begin serving him. This is when Saul was having the fits. Okay? Saul loved David very much, and David became his armor bearer. And then if you read the next couple of verses, that's where you see that he played the lyre for him to help calm his nerves and help calm his moods. So, remember who Jonathan is. Jonathan is Saul's son. So if David came into the court and was playing for Saul, if David became one of Saul's armor bearers, do you think Jonathan knew about it? Yeah, okay. It may be like how you know a person that, in another part of the building that you work in, that you see them, maybe you don't even know their name, but you recognize them because you see them often enough. And so Jonathan had to have a little bit of knowledge of David. Maybe didn't know his name, but knew that he was in his courts. But yet, that's not when that friendship was found. Okay? Going to chapter 17, verse 55, toward the end of chapter 17. And here, what had happened here was the battle was all done. the Israelites had chased off the Philistines, had ransacked the camps, done different things like that. If you read this, what you see is that David grabbed Goliath's armor and his head, okay? Because remember, he cut off his head. And it says he took his head and armor back to Jerusalem. So Saul had gone back to Jerusalem. Jonathan was with him. And look what it says. Saul watched David go out to fight the Philistine, and he asked Abner, the commander of his army, Abner, whose son is this young man? And Abner declared, I really don't know. Now again, that sounds odd, because in chapter 16, we got David playing the harp. We got David smoothing, Saul's nerves. We got Saul loving David so much he made him an armor bearer. So did Saul really not know who David was? Probably what Saul is doing here, Saul is seeing something unique in David. Something he hadn't seen before. And so he's asking, well, did David come from a long line of fighters, a long line of warriors? Did David's family, is there something I need to know about the family and who they are and what they are? He was trying to find out background about David, okay? And yeah, he probably didn't know who his family was. And so he's trying to get that information because he saw something special in David. Well, who else was there? Jonathan was there. And Jonathan also was seeing something special in David. So let's go back to the beginning of chapter 17, to the story of David and Goliath. We're not going to read the whole story. In fact, we're going to skip some of the familiar parts. We're going to read some of the other parts of the story, okay? But let's start in verse 1. The Philistines now mustered their army for battle and camped between Socoh and Judah, and as whatever. Saul encountered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. Does this sound familiar? Do you remember back in chapter 13 when we first started reading the story of Jonathan? What did we have? We had the Philistine army gathering together. They were at one place. The Israelite army was across the valley at another place. Very, very familiar. If you kind of look at these stories, and that's what we're going to do, we're going to look at the stories, you can see a lot of things basically the same. Okay? The Philistines and the Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley in between them. Here we go. Okay? Now look at the next thing. It says, then Goliath, the Philistine champion, came from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall, and he wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds, roughly 55 kilograms. Pretty heavy. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and as thick as a weaver's beam. It was tipped with iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. Again, about 6 kilograms, okay? And his armor bearer walked ahead of him carrying a shield. So you got this big army out there, Philistine army. The Israelites are going to face them, okay? Maybe they're a little bit scared, maybe they're a little bit shaky already, and then all of a sudden, this man comes out that stands probably this much higher than everybody else. King Saul was considered to be a tall man, and this man was a lot more taller than Goliath. And not only was he tall, he wasn't like tall and skinny, he was tall and he was wide. He wasn't wide like me, he was wide with muscle, okay? He was like an ox. Last summer, I met a guy where we were staying, wind blew down a tree, a big tree. So he came to chop up the tree and to take it away. And I shook hands with him. And when I shook hands with him, his hand felt like you're just grabbing a piece of steel. It was that hard. And his forearms must have been about this big. Well, they probably weren't that big, but they seemed like they were that big, okay? He was like, Popeye the Sailor Man. It's just this way he was. Because all day long, he worked heavy equipment. All day long, he worked that type of thing. And he was just He was just solid. That's who Goliath was. So he got him coming out there. He got him facing the Israelite army. And this is what he did. He stood and he shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. Why are you all coming out to fight? I'm the Philistine champion, but you're only servants of Saul. Choose one man and come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me. Now, what a lot of people don't know, and we're not 100% sure about this, but we think the Philistines may have been relatives somehow to the Greeks. Greeks, in their fights, in their wars, they did have a system where sometimes the whole armies wouldn't fight, but one champion would come out and fight against another champion, and if your champion lost, that means your whole army lost. If the other champion won, that means they won. And so you would avoid a lot of bloodshed, you would avoid a lot of destruction, you would avoid a lot of things by doing that. And so this is what Goliath was challenging them to. This was not something that was unusual. It was something that the Israelites had probably seen before. But he's challenging them to this. Now, of course, again, since he's a giant, since he's so big, he's so strong and everything else, he is scary. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Go back to the story of Jonathan, an armor bearer. 6,000 chariots and horses, troops more numerous than the sands of the sea or seashore. The Israelites were terrified and shaken and went into hiding. Same story. Very familiar things. Now, I have one other question about this that I can't answer today and nobody else seems to answer. Where was Jonathan during all this? Because the Jonathan we've gotten to know so far would have been out there facing the giant. And I have no idea. And everybody I ask has no idea. But here's what I think. Do you remember when Jonathan went against the Philistine garrison and destroyed the Philistine garrison, and then he went against the outpost and destroyed that? Saul kept asking, where's Jonathan? Where's Jonathan? And I have a feeling that Jonathan may have been right there with Saul, and Saul, all this is going on, and Saul's like, you cannot go. Because I think Jonathan probably wanted to go out there. Now, my speculation, my theory, my idea, my imagination, so you just take that for what it's worth, but that's how I'm going to tell the story. Look what happens next. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion, came from Gath. He came from out of the ranks. David heard him shout. I skipped a few verses, that's why I was a little bit confused. Remember, from this verse to this verse, what happens is Jesse, David's father, sends him to the front because he's got 3 older brothers in the army to take them food and supplies. And when he gets there, it says, as he was talking with them, that means as David was talking to his brothers and to other people in the army, Goliath, the Philistine champion, came out from Gath. He came out from Philistine ranks. He did this every day, so his daily thing. David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army, and as soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. So, as I've been mentioning, both stories, we find the Israelite army afraid of the Philistines. And then, what we see next is we find a leader has confidence in God to rescue them, to protect them, and to provide for them. Jonathan had confidence in God, and we're going to see David has confidence in God. So, skipping on down a few more verses, David continues to talk to the army. He finds out that Saul has promised that if anybody goes out and defeats the champion, that Saul will give his daughter to them in marriage. He'll give them other things and all these type of things. David's eyes get really big, and he's like, "Ooh, I'm going to go do that." You know why his eyes get really big? He says, "Oh, I'm going to go do that," because he knows God is with him. He has the confidence that God will defeat the giant, and then he's like, hey, all these rewards, it's like having icing on your cake, okay? It's like having a little syrup on your ice cream, whatever you want to think of it about it. He was excited, and he said, don't worry about this Philistine. I'll go fight him. I have done this. Now he goes on, describes about how he protects the lions, or protects the sheep. He's fought lions and bears and everything else. He said, I've done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defiled the armies of the living God. Whose honor is David willing to go fight for? Is it his own honor? No, it's for the honor of God. Whose honor was Jonathan wanting to fight for? His own honor? No, the honor of God. Do you see how they starting to, looks like they're thinking alike? It sounds like they're a little bit of kindred spirits already, right? Let's go on. When the Lord rescue from the claws of lion and bear, he will rescue me from the Philistine. So Saul finally consented. All right, go ahead, he said, and may the Lord be with you. And David is just like Jonathan. Jonathan said to the armor bearer, hey, if they call us up there and we know that's a sign from God, that God will defeat them for us and give us into our hands. And David says, hey, I can trust God because God has helped me defeat lions and bears, things I shouldn't have been able to. And I can defeat this Philistine because God is on my side. God will provide the victory for me. Again, very simple and very much the same. So, not only do we have that, we have a hero who gives God the credit, who does it for the honor of the Lord, not for his own honor. Okay? Then David replied to the Philistines, you come to me with this sword. Okay? So you went out there. He goes and meets the Goliath. And when Joshua and Jonathan were little, they liked me to tell the story. And they liked this part of the story that when Goliath saw him, he was like, laughing at David because David was such a little runt. He was a teenage boy, probably about 16, 17 years old. Okay? He hadn't even filled out as a man yet. And here he is, and he's coming up to this Philistine, this giant that has an armor bearer in front of him carrying a big shield, that has his big swords, his big spears, and David doesn't have anything. He doesn't have any armor on. Because Saul gave him his armor, and David started to move around with the armor and saying, I can't move with this. I can't do things with this. And so David took all that off. And so Goliath is laughing at him. The boys always wanted me to do that. Is what Goliath did, okay? He's laughing at him, okay? And then David says, you have come at me with sword, spear, and javelin. You rely on the things of this world. But I rely on God. I trust in God. My confidence comes from God. Look what he says. I have come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have defied. See, he's trusting in God. And he wants everyone to know that. Sounds a lot like Jonathan to me. Today, the Lord will conquer you. He didn't say, I will conquer you. He said, the Lord will conquer you. And I will kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and the wild animals. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Again, over and over again, it sounds just like Jonathan. He doesn't want the victory for himself. He wants it for God. He wants it for the glory and for the honor of God. Everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give us to you. We trust in God. He will deliver. So, we got a hero who gives God the credit, and we have heroes whose faith produces action. Look at this next verse. As Goliath moved closer to attack, Goliath, an armor bearer, walking slowly forward. What does David do? David doesn't say, okay, now how am I going to do this? David says, now is the time for action. So he runs at him. He didn't walk slowly. You know, if it had been me, my knees would have been shaking. I would have been taking little steps and pray, oh God, help me, help me, help me, help me. David just takes off running. He's a man of action, okay? And he runs out to meet him. He reaching into his shepherd's bag, and he takes out a stone. He hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. And he hit him so hard, it didn't bounce off. I was lots of pictures of lots of drawings, and the stone's always bouncing off, but that's not what happened. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face forward to the ground, or fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. And even that part, the Israelite army didn't have swords when they went against the Philistines before, and they won a great battle. All pointing toward God being in control and God doing it for them. And all pointing toward David and Jonathan's faith in God. So, we have heroes who produce actions, and then we have leaders who inspire others. Because what happens next? Then David ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from his sheath. David used it to kill him and to cut off his head. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, what did they do? They turned and ran. Then what happened? The men of Israel and Judah gave out a great shout of triumph, and they rushed after the Philistines. Story of Jonathan, the armor bearer, when they killed the 20 in the garrison that was over there overwatching everything. It says that the Philistine camp went into a panic, and God caused a panic there, and the Israelite army came out of the cracks, came out of the caves. The men of Ephraim joined them as well. They all rallied around Jonathan and followed Jonathan to chase the Philistines down. Here the same thing happens. They see what David did, and they all rally behind him and start chasing the Philistines. So we have leaders who inspired others, and then last thing, we have someone who God used to perform wonders. Then the Israelite army returned and plundered the deserted Philistine camp. David took the Philistines' head to Jerusalem, but he stored the man's armor in his own tent. Before David showed up, the Israelite army was not only fearful about facing Goliath the giant, but they were fearful about this Philistine army. Remember, for years upon years upon years, the Philistines would come into Israel. They would take all their grain, they would take all their animals, they would take anything of value and go back home, constantly raiding them. And so they were probably fearful if they lost this battle, what would happen to their families? What would happen to their livelihood? What would happen to them? And it all turned. And because God turned it, because David was faithful. He was faithful. So then in that verse 18, or chapter 18, verse 1, Jonathan watched all this going on. And Jonathan saw all this. And I think Jonathan probably went, finally someone who understands me. Someone who gets it. Someone who knows that if we just trust God and we follow God, everything will be good. And Jonathan looked at David and he said, that should have been me out there. I should have been the one doing this. He's got the same spirit I do. So he goes to David, maybe extends a hand and says, congratulations. You know, I don't know what they did back then, okay? Or, hey, can I see that head? You know, yeah, I don't know, okay? But he felt a connection. And David was probably 10 to 20 years younger than Jonathan. David heard the stories already about Jonathan and knew who Jonathan was. And David also then probably felt the same thing. Here's a man that I can trust. a man who follows God, a man who trusts in God, who believes in God, who is willing to risk his life, to do everything he has to follow God. I want to be a friend with him too. And so that friendship, that deep friendship that they had, was born out of this kindred spirit. That's the story. That's why that friendship was born. That's what drew them in together. Now there's a couple things we can apply here. And the one I mentioned already, why they had such a close friendship. But the other thing is, we need those friendships in our lives. And it's hard. It's difficult. And they only come around every once in a while. But just like Jonathan had to seize the moment, when you meet someone that you have that kindred spirit, you need to reach out and develop that friendship. Because that person will be there to support you, to love you, to correct you if you need to lift you up when you needed to be. They will be there for you. Think about your friendships. Find that kindred spirit. Right now, if you're thinking, well, I don't know anybody who could fit that role for me, who could be there for me, start praying and asking. Because the pre-story to Henny was I had been in Taiwan when I met Henny almost 5 years. And I told God, I said, probably just a few months even before, I don't remember how long, but in my prayers I told God, I said, God, I need a best friend here in Taiwan. I said, I need someone that I can open up and I can tell him my struggles. I can tell them my ideas, my thoughts. I can bounce things off of. I can ask to pray for me. Because I wanted that best friend. Yes, Jesus is my best friend. But I wanted somebody that could sit across the table from me and drink a coffee with me and say, you know, you or good or good boy, you know, whatever. And God provided that. So pray. Ask God, help me to find that. Then be open to who God may bring you, because he will bring you somebody. But remember that Jonathan's and David's friendship was based on a kindred spirit of serving God, of faith in God, of relying in God. And hopefully your kindred friend will be the same. Let's go to God in prayer.